Thank you all for coming on this rainy Chicago day. Welcome to the Frankie. I think I know all of you all. I'm Leah Feldman. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative Literature. I'm so honored to introduce today Hamid Ismailov, who's a renowned literary figure from Central Asia, and whose novels have garnered global acclaim in translation into French, German, English, Turkish, and beyond. Born in Kyrgyzstan, Hamid Agha was educated in Uzbekistan, but forced to leave due to political repression and censorship in the 90s. He has since lived in Moscow and London, where he was the BBC World Service writer in residence. He's now the Central Asian Director of Radio Free Europe in Prague. As a journalist and literary figure, he has produced an astonishing array of work, from experimental poetry to postmodern novels in both Uzbek and Russian. His work covers a range of topics from modernist Islamic thought to Stalinist repression in revolutionary Central Asia, to race and ethnicity and ecological crisis in the Soviet Empire. His work has been compared to Gogol, Platonov, and Bulgakov in the Russian tradition for its poignant magical realism and dark humor. However, Ismailov's work engages in a really astonishing array of intellectual and cultural traditions that range from Islamic philosophy and oral step poetry to modernist and Uzbek poetry and contemporary philosophy. His incredible oeuvre of work is now continuing to expand into new genres, both from working from a long tradition of classical poetry to now publishing a new serial work on the social networking platform Telegram. Some of his most notable works in English translation include The Railway, which was published in 1997 in Russian and then in English in 2006. And it's a folkloric novel that tells the story of a multinational community of Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Russians, Muslims, and Jews who live in a fictional railway town called Galas, highlighting cultural and political tensions in this tumultuous revolutionary period in Soviet Central Asia along the Iron Road, or this kind of symbol of the Soviet modernity project. Mombombo, his novel, which is translated as The Underground in English, which tells the story of a multiracial child whose mother is a migrant from Siberia, and his father is an athlete from an unnamed African country who comes to Moscow as part of the Soviet internationalist moment. And it tells the story of this young boy's experience kind of wandering around the Soviet metro during the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Devil's Dance, which is written in Uzbek and was winner of the EBRD Literary Prize in 2019. And it showcases intertwining narratives of a 19th century courtesan who navigates the intrigues of courts and harems of the Uzbek emirates and khanates in a time during this great game moment in the time when Britain and Russia are competing for influence in the region. And this story is intertwined along with the trials of a well-known Uzbek writer and literary dissident who's imprisoned and executed at the hands of the Soviet state in the 1930s. His most recent novel, Gaia, Queen of Ants, which is on sale here and available, was also written in Uzbek and centers around the kind of political corruption and ethnic conflict in contemporary Central Asia, and grapples with questions of faith, power, sex, and family. And I'm told that Hamid Agha is also working on two projects now, which maybe he can tell us a bit more, a novel called Russian Dolls and a digital novel that will be published in serial on Telegram, We Are Computers. I want to thank the Frankie for hosting us, and to Series and Translation Studies for their support. And also, as a note, the virtual audience we're monitoring in audio on Zoom. So If there are problems with the audio on Zoom, just let us know in chat, and we will resolve the issue. And for the in-person audience, we will get you a mic, and that way the virtual audience will be able to hear you. So we facilitate this strange inter-platform conversation. So please join me in welcoming Hamid Ismailov. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Will you introduce
so
us as well?
yes, yes, so yes, right, I should introduce everyone. I've forgotten my speaker bio sheet.
That's okay.
But, so
We can introduce ourselves.
I know you both, and I'm so excited to have you with me. And I apologize, but I've in the rain, I've forgotten my speaker bio sheet. So I will ask you to introduce yourselves so that I don't miss any of your accomplishments, which we should all know about. So.
I'm Hoda Shakry. I'm a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature, and I work in contemporary Arabic and Francophone literature from the Middle East and North Africa, and ethics and aesthetics. So I'm really excited to be in conversation today.
I'm also very excited to be here. I'm Tran. I teach in English and program and creative writing. I teach primarily fiction writing, and I'm a novelist.
Hamid, would you like to begin with a reading for us, and then
Okay.
maybe we can launch into a series of questions?
Thank you. Thank you. These virtual or hybrid events are quite interesting thing. You know, they reminded me my youth when I used to go in Tashkent to theater of opera, Navoy Theater of Opera, and ballet. Usually what was the case, you know, the orchestra was bigger than the audience usually. Yeah. So but nonetheless, you know, because the audience consisted, as I learned later, of real sort of, you know, real people who were valuing opera and ballet, maybe in small numbers, but thank you very much to come alive in front of us, and thanks to everyone who is joining us online. Since, you know, since the Third World War, well-forgotten sort of, you know, fear of the humanity is once again topical these days. I'm going to read maybe an extract from my novel, which is called The Dead Lake. The Dead Lake is the novel about the two families who are living next to the Semipalatinsk nuclear polygon. And in one family, there is a boy, in another family, there is a girl, which are sort of, you know, born nearly at the same time. So they grow up together, and due to different sort of, you know, explosions, radiation, all of that, so boy stops to grow and girl continues to grow. So the story goes about the boy who never grown up. And his name is Yerzhan. So the scene which I'm going to read is about Yerzhan and those two families. The joy of the steppe, the joy of music, and the joy of childhood always coexisted in Yerzhan with the anticipation of that inescapable, terrible, abdominal thing that came as rumbling and trembling, and then swirling, sweeping tornado from the zone. At such times, Uncle Shaken was usually away on his work shift. But on the rare occasions when he was at home, he, Granddad Dowlet, and Uncle Kepek argued non-stop while they were locked inside with the families for several days. Shaken, who was blamed for everything that was happening, lit up like the steppe itself when there was a blast. He preached to the others that it was more than just an atom bomb. It was our Soviet response to the arms race, without which we would all have been gone a long time ago. But the blasts were necessary for peaceful purposes too, in order to build communism. It's our absolute duty not merely to catch up, but or to overtake the Americans. In case there is a third world war, he concluded with his hallmark phrase. Stop giving us the propaganda line, Granddad replied, equally heated. He had fought in both world wars. In the first, he dug trenches in the rear, and in the second, he had reached the Elbe on foot and fraternized with the Americans there. There is nothing in the world worth fighting a war for. I understand the railway. It transports people and cargo. That's good for everyone. But what good does your atom schmatom do? You've turned the entire steppe into a desert. You never see a gerbil or a fox. And the menfolk can't get it up anymore. Kepek intervened with an incomprehensible assertion of his own, which made Shaken look away shamefacedly. One day in late autumn, after one of these periods of incarceration with long arguments, Shaken went to the city and brought a television back home. If I can't do it, let this educate you, he announced. Not much troubled Yerzhan in those days. There were, of course, the explosions in the zone, which the boy never called by their proper name out of visceral fear. But besides that, he had only one other worry. Which side in the Third World War would Dean Reed be on? With his head full of constant arguments between Shaken and Granddad Dowlett about the imminent Third World War, and his nightmares of little silver planes suddenly turning into iron eagles and diving at him as if he were a fox cub running across the steppe, unable to find a burrow or any kind of refuge from the rumbling or the darkening sky, or the new sun rising in the black sky, or the mushroom hanging over the steppe, Yerzhan would wake soaked in sweat, curled up tight like a fox cub, and think in horror, afraid to move, which side was Dean Reed on? Who could he tell about these nocturnal fears? Petko and all the others believed he was a faithful disciple of Leonid Kogan, the famous violinist. So with whom could he share his torment about Dean Reed? You might know Dean Reed was the Red Elvis, you know, and this boy is in love with this Dean Reed. It's his American dream in a way, in the middle of nowhere in the Kazakh steppe, where the explosions, 468 were sort of in number, explosions of nuclear were tested. And these people were living as the byproduct. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, I mean, in kind of following up in this really powerful selection that you just read about, the kind of daily life along the, in the face of this, kind of nuclear plant and the possibility of catastrophe. So many of your novels center around these either industrial or ecological, industrial causeways, or these sites of potential ecological crisis. And the railroad centers around the railroad itself, right? And I'm wondering to what extent, what role technology plays in your work. I mean, especially thinking about this new novel that you're writing, or this new series that you're writing on, and we're going to publish on Telegram. What role does technology play, both in terms of the arc of the stories that you write, and in terms of the ways that you seek to innovate your literary language, both in Russian and in Uzbek?
Very interesting question. Thank you for this question. During the Soviet time, we, as the Soviet product, were educated in a way, in an ideological way. basically we knew everything about the history of ideas, but not about the history of things. Or, for example, when I came to the West, I was already 40 or so, you know, in one book, they were sort of, you know, celebrating when the McDonald's was created. Yeah. Big Mac when was created. So that part of the sort of, you know, the material part, though the communism was all about materialism, but yet we were brought up in the sort of, you know, history of ideas. So as if the sort of material world didn't exist around us. So everything was about ideologies, about ideas. In that sense, you know, coming to the West sort of opened my eyes to the sort of history of the things, history of the technology, history of the material world. And here, obviously, you can't go to any of the sort of, you know, extremes of that, you know, like we did with the Soviet Union. We went into the extremes of the ideology. You can't go into the extremes of the sort of thingishness as well, in a way. So there should be a balance, apparently. And the balance is when the ideas, the technological development, let's say, should fit the ideas as well, the ideal world as well. For example, let's take two examples. For example, even Taliban wants the new technology, yeah, with all their ideas, sort of backward ideas of, I don't know, of which century, yet they are using the modern technology. If the technology now develops to unite us, yeah, like, for example, internet, like social media, if technology is developing to unite us, all the ideas who are standing against that must be sort of, you know, rethought in a way, must be revisited in a way. Or in the other sense, you know, if you take the other side of the same equation, yeah, if the, for example, technology develops in order to kill as many of us as possible, so maybe here, once again, you know, the ideas which are creating this technology must be changed as well. So there is always this sort of balance between the ideas and technology, which should be reached for the humanity, for the better of humanity, in a way. So maybe that is what interests me in my novels when I'm trying to find this balance, maybe between the sort of, you know, zeal for modernity and the ideas which we're living with.
I was hoping to kind of transition from the kind of material, technological, but also ideological, maybe to the realm of spiritual life, which I feel is so rich in your writing. So your novels, they build these really capacious worlds. And I'm especially interested in how you sort of have these characters that cross languages and religious beliefs and ideologies, political affiliations, ethnicities, but particularly the way that you represent Islam. And I think at this moment, it's so crucial to think through this as this very kind of diverse set of practices and beliefs and teachings is one of the most captivating things, I think, in some ways about your writings about Central Asia and the diversity of its people. And I've been thinking about how across all the different sort of permutations of how Islam is practiced across the world, and the Muslim populace is so broadly distributed, there is at its core this kind of conjunction around the wonderment of reading, reading as a site of kind of spiritual cultivation, and the way that knowledge sort of develops for both the self and the divine through acts of reading and the transmission of texts, whether it's the Quran or other sort of texts. And so, you know, you talk in a lot of your works about Sufism and how Sufi practices continue to be kind of transmitted within Central Asia, the different sort of pedagogical and spiritual literature. I'm wondering if maybe you can speak a little bit about how the principles or the practices of Sufism, which I know you were exposed to in your sort of early religious training, maybe inflect your writing, inform your writing, any influences?
Thank you, thank you. It's quite a question, yeah, uh, because you're absolutely right. You could yourself in your book, for example, could, you know, about Quran and literature of Maghreb. You are talking about that. Generally, when we are sort of, you know, we don't like something, it creates in us kind of, you know, a monolith something, yeah.
Mhm.
So for the Western perception, Islam is like a monolith, you know, which is, for example, I'll give you an anecdote. For example, I'm very often invited to represent Islam, yeah, as a writer. You would never imagine Ian McEwan, for example, sitting and representing Christianity, for example, yeah. So this kind of sort of, you know, monolithizing the thing is very, very sort of incorrect and unhealthy. Islam consists of so big variety of sort of beliefs, of you know, of everything. In fact, I think Sufism was one of the way of adopting sort of general Islamic religion towards the sort of your cultural practices. Why, for example, Central Asia is so rich for the Sufi schools, yeah? Yassaviya is there, Naqshbandiya is there, Qadiriya is there, Kubraviya is there. That is the sort of, you know, adopting the world religion for your own sake. The same has happened with Christianity as well. You know, English people adopted it in Anglicanism, Germans, they've adopted in, let's say, in Protestant, Lutheranism, and so on and so forth. Huh?
My people have adopted it.
Yes. So the same is with Islam, you know, when the problem appears when people not adopt the religion for their own sake, like it happened with Russian Orthodoxy, for example, you know, or Greek Orthodoxy. Imagine Greeks who sort of created the whole civilization. Who are they? I mean, I don't want to say, but in a sort of, you know, in modern world, in spiritual matters, yeah, they can represent sort of something, but when you compare them with their past, for example, what's their sort of, you know, all value as the Orthodox Christians, for example, they decided not to adopt Christianity for their own beliefs of the great civilization. You see, so Sufism is exactly the same. At the same time, we know the, you know, the theories that in every religion there is the sort of, you know, the angle or the corner where people strive for the sort of universality, as you said, for their own sake and for the sort of, you know, for the community's sake. Like, for example, Gnosticism in Christianity or Kabbalah in Judaism, Sufism in Islam. That is the common place where people sort of, you know, trying to overcome the borders of the religion in a way. So in that sense, obviously, Sufism, the thing is, which interests me. But once again, you know, there are different schools of Sufism. For example, there are schools where sort of, you know, just about God and that's it, yeah? Not thinking about the life here. Everything is for hereafter. But the schools which were created in Central Asia, like Naqshbandiya, the motto of which is dast bakar dil bayor. So your heart is with the God, but your hands is with your work. So that is, you know, kind of religion which should be applied, you know, which gives exactly the sort of this balance without with modernity and the ideology. So you have to work and to create the modernity with your hands, you know. You have to be an engineer at the same time, the sort of, you know, the thinker. Like, for example, in the medieval times, Ibn Sina was, or Al-Farabi was, and all others, you know, Al-Khwarizmi, after whom we are naming algorithm. Yeah, so all of that, unfortunately, is forgotten within Islam. So obviously, maybe as a writer, as a sort of intellectual, you have to sort of guide your audience towards that kind of Islam.
And I especially appreciated in the piece that you wrote on Platonov, where you sort of read his text as a Sufi text. So there you kind of even adopt it as a lens of critical reading or analysis as well, not just as a mode of writing.
It was partly hooliganism as well. You know,
There was a little bit
literally.
of mischief in there.
Yes.
Yeah. As a follow-up, because I've been thinking about this question of genre because so much of Sufism is about sort of the telling of parables as kind of spiritual pedagogical tools, but also I know that you're very interested by the sort of satirical oral storytelling of Mullah Nasruddin, for example. And so I've just was wondering if you could talk to us a little, because you write across so many genres: journalism, essays, poetry, fiction. If you could maybe speak about sort of your relationship to genre and the oral, the literary, the technological, perhaps.
During the Soviet Union, it was a challenge, you know, to write in many genres because everything was sort of monolith in the Soviet sense, monolith once again, you know, and if you are marked as a poet, you wouldn't go anywhere else, yeah. But I was interested in many things, you know, in mathematics, in philosophy, in all of kind of things, you know, in biology. So I decided to create kind of heteronyms, different people in a way, yeah. So which I called the Conference of Refined, yeah. So Majalisun Nafais, so called, yeah. So and I started to write, for example, under the name of apparatchik of the philosophical treatises, under the name of Altair Magdi satirical novels, under the name of Belgi poetry, new wave of poetry, experimental poetry, and so on and so forth. Many of them, they became much more famous than myself, those people. So, and nobody knew about those people because during the perestroika time, lots of new people appeared and so on and so forth. About genres, you know, I'm coming from Uzbekistan, and Uzbekistan is, because of sort of, you know, Islamic tradition, the sort of monotheistic tradition, yeah, because of the communism there and so on and so forth, was quite sort of, you know, about the mono. In what sense? For example, the author should be there, yeah, as the mono author, yeah, as the mono author. So everything was from top down, yeah. I said, you listen, kind of. So the challenge for me as a writer was always to turn this mono of the Uzbek consciousness. For example, even the music of Uzbeks is monody, so-called monodical music, not polyphonic, but monody. All instruments, they are playing the same. Yeah. So apparently, it's a challenge for a creative person to challenge all of that, yeah, and to create something which is at the same time Uzbek, but at the same time different to what existed until now. So my experiment was about giving voices, but to others, at least. Not to myself, yeah, as the author. I told and you listen. No, it was giving voice to you, to you, to you, for example, to create those heteronyms which were talking as the either protagonists or main characters or the authors. Exactly the same in my books as well. You know, I'm giving the voice, for example, for 12-year the boy who is living in Moscow during the, you know, who should have become Pushkin of our time, but because of the racial sort of pressures, committed suicide. At the age of 12 years, let's say. I'm giving my voice to him, yeah, in order to express that reality. I'm giving the voice to Yerzhan, who is 28 years old, but his shape is 12 years old boy, yeah. I'm giving in the Gaia, for example, voice to 4 people who are representing elements, yeah, different elements, and I'm discovering more and more that they are like in Faulkner's Sound and Fury, you know. So that was my, in a way, challenge to create polyphony out of monody, in a way.
Do you feel ever that the characters, that writing those characters change, have an effect of changing?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Because I was listening to them in a way, you know, what this philosopher is saying, would I accept, for example, what this philosopher is saying, let's say, or that poet, would I write the poetry like he did, for example? It's a, it's a, you know, overdeveloped time of schizophrenia, you know.
Well, I wonder if I can ask you about maybe transition to the voice of the individual, the personal voice, and you know, transition to a question about exile itself, and you know, the figure of the stranger in a strange land, that difficulties and ambiguities of that experience, whether it's emotional or intellectual or practical. What I'm actually curious about is, even in those difficulties, have you found over the years, whether for yourself or for other exiles, other strangers, that there is an aspect of that experience that has its advantages, that has possibilities and capabilities that are unique to being a stranger in a strange land?
I would treat this question into sort of, you know, into kind of manners. Yeah, one in aesthetical, yeah, in aesthetical way, you know, using a stranger as sort of, you know, an engine for your thoughts, for example, is quite well-known thing. Basically, the best novels of humanity is about strangers, starting from Don Quixote and ending, I don't know, with Stranger of Camus, let's say. Yeah. So basically, it's always the strangeness or strangeness of my mind, for example, of Orhan Pamuk. So it's always the stranger, the weirdo, the queer, whatever we name, yeah, is the sort of, you know, the mover of our interest in a way. You know, we are attracted to those.
Absolutely.
Yes. Apart from everything else, you know, the Russian school of formal literature, Shklovsky, for example, he said about the aesthetics of ostranение, which is which could be translated like estranging. You know, you are always, for example, create the situation as you are seeing it for the first time. Yeah, as a stranger, with the eyes of the stranger. So that is the aesthetical part of the question. But there is the ethical, which you are raising, yeah, and I know in your novel as well, for example, you know, you are using it, you know, the stranger as the other. Yeah, like Vietnamese, for example, girl in your novel is a stranger in terms of other. So here we're in ethical terms, we're coming to the issue of otherness, yeah, which is the central key point of our existence in this world for the time being. You know, when we are seeing that even the closest nations to each other make sort of, you know, like Russians are fighting Ukrainians now, yeah, denying their existence, yeah, of other, yeah. So the otherness is the key problem for us, you know, whatever form this otherness takes, you know, be it religious, be it, as we said earlier, be it ethnical, be it sexual, be it whatever. So here, the ethical part of this issue is, once again, the social part of this issue is extremely, extremely important. And we have as writers, as the intellectuals, challenge the sort of, you know, the this belonging notion, yeah, always, that we are group, we are us, and others are others. Yeah.
Mm.
Because sometimes, you know, literature, the more I think about literature, literature creates these silos as well. As much
We do.
we're challenging,
We do.
literature creates these silos. Okay, I'm sort of, you know, in every meeting with my readers, I'm talking about the sort of, you know, mononationality of the novels, you know, not like yours, for example. You are representing different ethnicities in your novels, but look at the mainstream literature. All of it is mononational, monoethnic. You know, I understand where they're coming from, though they are saying that very often they are saying, out of political correctness, I can't represent someone else, not being someone. I was, for example, you know, criticized for example, for showing the life of black people in Russia, for example. Yeah, you are not black, you can't represent them. But my grandchildren are black, I would say, for example. You know, so sometimes it happens that you write first and then it turns into your experience, for example. Yeah, but point is not that I'm not black or whatever. You know, point is that to dare to be in the shoes of others.
Yeah, there's an irony sometimes I see that in the building of community, you can create those silos, that you can create exclusion unintentionally, right? But it sometimes is a consequence of that, and I don't know what to make of that. You know.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You know.
I'm thinking too of, you said that you discovered your Uzbekness in Moscow, and I mean, so much of this conversation and the moment that we're living in is about this, you know, turn to nationalism, which, you know, since the fall of the Soviet Union, but has now taken on the new faces in the rise of ethno-nationalism and fascist movements more broadly. But I'm thinking about the internationalism that you experienced in your youth, and which inspires so much of your writing and takes place in so many of your novels, both in this like multi-vocal quality of the heterodox and heteroglossic quality that your novels have, but also in the kind of communities that they create, the multinational communities. And I'm curious about the influence of, you know, if you could say a little bit more about the being, you know, your experience as part of this kind of period of multinationalism in the Soviet Union. The writers' festivals was such a big moment of international writers' festivals, international film festivals, and the kind of connections that were created even on those contexts in which, in kind of underground ways or ways that were kind of outside of the state. But I'm wondering if you'd say more about that moment and what you see now in the current moment that we're in, and how those kind of international and kind of international connections with writers across both ethnic and national borders can be facilitated.
It's very much connected to the previous issue of otherness. My first, you know, my first kind of, you know, when I first met this otherness was when I was 3 years old. Then I was from the traditional family, Uzbek family, with grannies, you know, who were telling me all kind of stories of 1001 Night. And my mother decided to bring me to the kindergarten. And the kindergarten was the Russian one. Obviously, when you are 3 years old and don't speak Russian, so you are perplexed, you know, you are shocked when you are seeing others whom you can't understand. I do remember still my first Russian word, you know, novenький, which I immediately kind of, you know, started to associate with novot, novot, which is the grape sugar. So, and I thought that it's all right if I'm sort of, you know, sweet for them, for others in a way. So this otherness is, you know, is in a way blessing maybe when, you know, for example, you live through different people throughout your life. Yeah, you were sort of thrown in different situations among different people, which was the history of my life, my biography, basically. I was always somewhere else, you know, not within my sort of called group, yeah, the majority of the time. And it's a blessing in a way. You know why? For example, you said that in Moscow, I started to feel myself, for example, as an Uzbek. I must say that in Uzbekistan, I used to feel myself, you know, more reading the Western literature, translating Western literature. So there is always this balancing act between belonging, yeah, belonging, and between sort of defying it, and by that defining yourself in a way. But all of a sudden I noticed that even the creator of the author of the word belonging, yeah, had this sort of distance, you know, belonging about something, you know, so not being inside of something when you can't see anything. But you have to have, especially as a creative person, you have to have a distance in order to sort of estrange yourself from the group which you are belonging, in order to understand, in order to see, in order to challenge, in order to sort of, you know, define yourself and the group as well. So maybe that is the blessing, but at the same time, a burden of being a writer or intellectual, maybe within the group, when you have to be critical as well, you know. So I think it's a balancing act. And when you are talking about internationalism, for example, maybe you are serving as one of the bridges, you know, between those sort of groups which are feeling themselves as the sort of, you know, opposite or whatever.
Actually, I had a quick follow-up on that idea of belonging. I mean, when you're writing as a writer, and I know it's your goals are both here, but are you more conscious, for example, the decision of what language to write in? Are you more conscious of that decision as a way to build your own sense of belonging, you know, to a community, to a nationality, etc.? Or are you more conscious of creating that sense of belonging in your audience? Does that make sense? Or, I'm sure it's both, but I wonder how you balance that.
Yes. I think it's a sort of, you know, I think it's a sort of chicken and egg question in a way, you know. Why? Because you are writing, first of all, for your own curiosity, for your own sort of, you know, you are trying to understand this world, you are trying to understand the belongings, or all of that, all of that. But at the same time, you know, so what's first, you know, your language or yourself, For example, Joseph Brodsky used to say that we are part of the language, we belong to the language, In that sense, I think, yes, we can't say that we belong to language, because we are born into certain languages, For example, I was born into Uzbek, with all sort of, you know, history of this language, with all sort of, you know, history of people who spoke this language, who created something in this language. In a way, I was imprisoned by this language. In a way, I was taken hostage by this language. In a way, I was hand-clipped by this language. But the issue for the creative person is turning this handcliff into something creative, you know, not to bash others, you know, with your handcliff and sort of kill others, but maybe to give sort of, you know, to break the window and give freedom to yourself and to other people, maybe.
I like that.
Maybe that is the sort of, you know, the role of the language, you know, and belonging of to the language.
I have a related question about you as a reader, not just a writer. So this idea of sort of communities created through literature. I know in some of your interviews you've mentioned that there was a kind of fetishization of Western or translated literature in Russia and the former Soviet Empire when you were growing up. And I'm just curious, what kind of books did you read growing up? Obviously, this must have shifted as you sort of transitioned from Uzbek into Russian, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay. Okay, so during the Soviet time, yes, the newspaper which we used to read was За рубежом, the digest of the international press, and the magazine which we used to read was Иностранная литература, which is foreign literature, which translated, you know, you name all, you know, all kind of writers throughout the world, you know, V.S. Naipaul was translated, Faulkner was translated. I mean, all great American writers, up to, for example, during, even in the 80s, Joyce Carol Oates was translated.
Okay.
Yes. So in that sense, yes, we were reading quite a lot of that, but coming before that, for example, to my childhood, maybe. So I was reading the Soviet literature, but luckily, you know, luckily or unluckily, you know, I was looking after my granny because my mother died very early and I was left with my granny. My granny was quite ill and needed always a massage. Yeah. And I, as a boy, was the person to perform it. And while massaging, I also had the task to read her. And she loved 1001 Night. 8 volumes, you know, were read to her with all hatred of a boy, you know, who wants to play football. Yes. But that was, you know, school by default, you know, in a way. So, which gave me the feeling of other sort of, you know, countries like Damascus or, you know, of places like Damascus or other places. Then I do remember my first foreign book, which was For Whom the Bell Tolls. Obviously, the first thing I remembered was the Abuela's cojones there, you know, but nonetheless, that was the sort of, you know, the first the book which I read in English fully. And then it started, you know, and then it started so if you are asking me, for example, which book I cherish most of all, which English book I read when you know, my mood is sort of, you know, is bad, so it's Tristram Shandy. Yes, Tristram Shandy, which makes me absolutely fine in 5 minutes as soon as I'm sort of, you know, starting to read it. So that is the maybe answer. But now I'm listening to books. Due to my glaucoma, I'm listening to books, and what I found, I'm listening to many more books than I used to read. Really? Because in order to read, you have to make time. Yeah. Whereas listening, you can just walking. So I'm listening to everything, you know, which I missed during my life. Yeah. So I'm catching up with everything. So the latest I was listening is 3 books of Andrei Kurkov, the Ukrainian writer. Yeah. Whom I know, but I decided to sort of, you know, to re-understand him once again.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Do you find that that listening to books changes the way that you write, or thinking about the relation to the oral?
Absolutely, absolutely. First thing I discovered, not I discovered, I've just sort of, you know, I've understood that our listening capacity is much more developed than our reading capacity. I mean, because of the length of our listening experiences. I mean, we are listening since we were created as human kind, whereas we are reading starting from maybe Gutenberg or whatever. Yeah, earlier than Gutenberg, but yeah, much later than we are listening. Then, you know, you start to think about the musicality, about the digestion, and so on and so forth. Lots of things which are, you know, and you are listening critically. I don't know how other people listen, but I'm listening very much critically. For example, finding six, editorial mistakes, for example, in Tolstoy's in Tolstoy's Смерть Ivana Denisovича, and thinking that his wife wasn't, attentive enough to to edit those things, So yeah, it's a wonderful experience, and I recommend you listen to books.
I wanted to open up the conversation to the audience. I'm sure you have questions, and also to the virtual audience. If you send your questions in, we will read them. Mark, yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Here's the microphone. So I actually just wanted to kind of continue the conversation, where it was going about the sort of difference between sort of reading. You spoke about the difference between reading and listening. And then I wanted to sort of ask about like where Telegram kind of connects to that, because actually what you just said sort of was a bit surprising to me, because like I feel like for myself, right, I mean, reading a book, right, physical book, it's always very intimate experience, right? And then you said, actually, I took you to mean that you're a more critical hearer than you are a kind of reader. And I mean, I was thinking about, wondering what you thought would be different for a reader of your work who was kind of getting it through Telegram, right? Like, what were you sort of thinking about there? Because, like if I'm looking at something on a screen or phone, and maybe it's just because I'm old, but like that's a very unintimate experience for me. And I mean, I just wondered if there was something about, if you experienced that as a kind of lack of intimacy, and if
in my youth. I decided to sort of, to master the quick reading, the sort of fast reading. When you are reading like that, yeah, and who fell victim to my experiment was Dickens. 30 volumes of Dickens I read, in one go.
He deserves it.
In one go, and everything is mixed up in my mind, Pickwick with Nicholas Nickleby, all of them, they are sort of, in one, under one umbrella, So maybe therefore I'm not very critical in reading, because I was spoiled as a reader in my youth, maybe. But as a listener, as I'm saying, it's much more gratifying thing. But it was by default. The same is publishing my work on Telegram it's the only option for me. Unfortunately, my Uzbek books are banned in Uzbekistan and nobody can publish them. They published one of my book when the previous president died. The day that he died, they sent it from online to print.
Wow.
And until the second president was appointed, the book was out, So without any consent of mine. Yes, but I sort of, saluted this kind of clandestine or whatever publishing. Unfortunately, otherwise I'm banned. And therefore, Facebook or Telegram is a search for the reader. A search for the reader. I understand all the, all the caveats of publishing of it. Yeah, I would rather prefer that they are sort of, keeping this book in their hands and then kissing and then putting to the to the shelf or whatever. But unfortunately, it's not the case. Yes, and I have to, and I have to sort of, satisfy with being published, in small script and on the smart or not smartphone.
Well, in the sense that one carries around a phone in the pocket. Maybe it's like the new, like roman poche or something.
I was kind of hoping to, is this on? I didn't, okay. I was kind of hoping to circle back to some of what we were mentioning in the beginning of the conversation about the transmission of narrative ideas around Central Asia. And I was wondering if you had anything else to say about the transmission of ideas and language through different forms of art and literature. So that means anything from Sufi poetry, right, to shamanistic song, or, and there are all these different forms. Like the first book I read was the Shahnameh, like the Persian Book of Kings. And then the last book I read that like changed my life was The Idiot by Dostoevsky. And somewhere in between there, sometimes I wonder whether there is something that is lost in translation. And I was wondering whether you thought that the flow of ideas across different languages and origins within Central Asia specifically had anything of specific significance to you or your stories.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me start with to be back to the question of modernity and the language. Yeah. So modernity, in a way, I don't know, it's a sort of question to discuss, but there is a certain, there are certain risks for different languages, with the modernity. Because what modernity creates, it creates lots of sort of, development in technology. It creates lots of new concepts and new sort of, terms, let's say, yeah, which are, which languages of small nations are not catching up. Because the majority of so-called scientific literature is nowadays is created, let's say, in English, yeah, the majority. Even the languages like French, like Spanish are catching up with English in terms of the sort of, new terms and so, which are appearing, every day, for example, yeah. Other languages, the small languages, they are struggling with it. Even the simplest things like, for example, like the password, yeah, which wasn't used at all in our languages for centuries, maybe, yeah. For example, the Persians came up for the password initially with the word you would understand, Galan Kim, who is coming. Who is coming, which was the password during the sort of, Ottoman or whatever time, during the Sassanid time, the password for person to come and then to be allowed to go somewhere, yeah. So those sort of, people are struggling. And obviously they will be quite behind, because they have no capacities of English-speaking world or Chinese-speaking world to catch up with those developments. On the smaller scale, what you are saying, for example, yeah, obviously, in terms of the sort of non-technological, the other part of the thing, yeah, the ideological part, they are well developed. I mean, for example, psychologically, the Hindi language or Sanskrit or whatever is developed to the extent that English should catch up with it, yeah, maybe. So the same is with the things like Shahnameh, or other sort of, the summits of the national consciousness of different people. So in that sense, there are lots of challenges, which are unnoticeable now, but which will become on surface more and more. Like, for example, catching up with the technological development. Have I asked your question? Yeah.
Hold on. Come on.
Do you mind just waiting for the mic?
If I could be so bold as to expand on it even more, I would ask what you would then say about, going back to, I guess, the genre or like the other literary forms, because I think that's also something I've acknowledged in my own like health research, is that there is this gap of research knowledge and terminology that is leaving a lot of people behind who should be able to and would benefit from being able to conduct their own research and use the correct terminology. But what you see when you go back in time is that some of these earliest medical texts, like the Jahangirnama was like where Ayurvedic medicine was first documented, I'm pretty sure, and then the Tibetan medical thangkas, and these were all dependent on artistic depictions. They're all dependent on drawings of the human form. And I feel like I've learned so much just from looking at some of these texts, and yet I don't speak a single word of Tibetan or read a single character of Sanskrit. So I was wondering if, you've mentioned in your discussion that you think we need to revisit these ideas of how we have structured our ways of learning and of connecting with one another. And I was wondering if you had any ideas on how we could maybe reevaluate a more integrative form of connection with one another in order to do so.
Here we're coming to the most painful point of mine, the issue of sort of, translation from the small language, so-called small languages. Why we need the translations from small sort of obscure languages like Uzbek or Georgian or I don't know, Sinhalese or whatever, or Amhara or whatever. The human kind has developed in different languages. These are the different models of development in a way, sometimes, what was found in, I don't know, in the corner of Africa could help all the humanity, for example, in certain tasks, for example, So sometimes someone's literature, as you are saying, for example, could cure the sort of, the spiritual illnesses of other people, for example. If you read, for example, Al-Ghazali, for example, he is extremely, extremely, extremely precise in curing the spiritual illnesses, like, for example, the zeal for the fake news or whatever. He knows exactly how to deal with those kind of things, with liars, for example, or with dishonest people. He has got the recipes for that one. So in that sense, I do believe that technology would help us to, develop the sort of, new translational mechanisms from different languages and so on and so forth. Yes. Though the whole development goes, as I'm saying, predominantly in 2-3 languages, but the experience exists in hundreds of languages. And we have to use this experience for the benefit of all of us.
I have a question from the Zoom audience from Mary Nicholas, who asks, is language choice also related to the search for the reader to an extent? Does that explain your use of Russian at all? I'm fascinated by the choices of multilingual writers as to which language to use. It's especially fascinating with writers who were raised in the internationalism of the Soviet Union.
So this question was the question which I was struggling with for all my life, thinking why I'm writing certain books in certain languages. So I found the answer while touring United States, 2 weeks ago, no, a week ago.
Wow.
So I found the answer after sort of intensive interrogation by my readers. So the answer is, not so much you search for the readers, in that sense, I would have written my novels in Chinese, first of all, yeah. But it's more about, the kind of message or communication or discussion which you would like to make with certain group of people talking certain sort of language. When I'm writing in Russian, so I'm addressing with a sort of, with a point to discuss to the audience which speaks Russian. I understood it okay, in the case of my novel, for example, the Dead Lake, out of which I wrote, I read the excerpt. Yeah, why I didn't read it in Uzbek, for example, because for the Uzbek audience, it's not the top of the agenda. Though it's a horrible story of the Soviet Union, and lots of Uzbeks can find it applicable to their experiences, but it's not the sort of, in the focus of their attention. It's not the point of discussions or debate with them. And that is the sort of, the explanation why I wrote it in Russian. The same that goes with the Uzbek novels. Though, for example, Gaia, Queen of Ants, is written without any Uzbeks in it. There are no Uzbeks in it. But the issues and the challenge and the point in discussion is exactly addressed to the Uzbek audience. I would like to discuss with them the issues of Uzbekness without Uzbeks.
Thank you. I have sort of just a direct plea for advice from you. As somebody whose livelihood has been to teach Russian texts in American classrooms, up until about 8 weeks ago, when we were training our undergraduates to think about this literary tradition, we often expected that if they were lucky, they would spend a semester or even a year in a city like St. Petersburg or Moscow. Obviously, that's become impossible. And I was really interested to learn this morning, in fact, that I received an email. Some people in this room might have also seen this, that the majority of formerly study abroad programs that sent American students to Russia are now planning to send American students to Bishkek to continue their study of the Russian language and Russian literature. And I just wanted to ask, what would you tell those students, and what would you like them to prepare for before a trip like that, where they're sent to a country that they may never have heard of, surrounded by people they might never have thought about, and told, you will here learn Russian and also here read Russian literature?
So what would be my advice? I would tell them that Kyrgyzstan is the Switzerland of Central Asia. I mean, they will definitely fall in love with Kyrgyzstan. It's a stunningly beautiful country. It's the most open country in Central Asia, the most sort of, dynamic, very, very open-minded, and additional bonus, the Russians of Russia are moving to Central Asia in numbers. Young, aspiring IT Russians, sort of, IT or sort of professional Russians are moving in their thousands to Central Asia, including to Bishkek.
I kind of want to go.
And it's a country, recommend them to read Chingiz Aytmatov, the world-class writer, especially Jamila. Yeah. His early things, yeah, recommend them to read early things of Aytmatov.
So we have another question from the Zoom audience, and who has a question about Wunderkind Ercan. Is Ercan a fictional character?
Not completely. I met this person in one of my trips, and that was me in the book, the Unnamed Hero. That was me who met this particular person. Yes, I met him, but obviously, yeah, the work of fiction is always work of fiction. But the character, the main character of the sort of 28 years man who was left in the shape of 12 years old boy, was seen by me in 1989. And moreover, there are still people like him, you know, in Kazakhstan with all kind of deformities, with all kind of, you know, conditions. Like, for example, there are kids with, they are burning nowadays as well, because you never know how long it will continue, you know, the effects of radiation. They are, they were born, for example, with crystallized blood, for example. So you have to keep them on medicine constantly. Unless you are keeping them on medicine, their blood is crystallizing. So there are conditions, horrible conditions of kids who are born there nowadays.
Any other questions?
Actually, a quick question that I wanted to ask after Leah's first question about technology, and I'm just curious how you thought that technology has changed the experience of the migrant, of the exile, of you know, anyone who is no longer in the land that they were born.
It's connected with the land in a way, you know, you've got the opportunity every day to talk to your sister who lives in Uzbekistan, for example. You can talk to your father who lives in Kyrgyzstan, you know, not every day, but maybe once in a week time. So you are not deprived of your language because it's full on the social media, the latest trends in your language, you know, all kind of swear words you could appearing nowadays. So everything is on online now, and we are becoming sort of more and more virtual. What's interesting, what's happening with the, you know, with the humanity as well. So the previous era or civilization was sort of connected or connecting the world with the railways. Yeah. That was the network which used to connect the world. Now it's www, which is connecting the world. And it's becoming more and more sort of, you know, virtual in a way. It moves towards the idealistic side of the humanity in a way. So it's an interesting sort of, you know, development from the railway to www.
I just remember growing up in the 80s, and a phone call from Vietnam just felt so alien and odd, and of course you can't talk very long because it would have been so expensive. And now, you know, they can just, you know, my uncle from Saigon, it's like trying to, you know, video call me on Facebook or whatever. So many different platforms to do it. There's just so many options, and I compare it to my upbringing. It's just no comparison anymore.
So if you've written a novel about the railway and then the underground metro and then the radio, will there be now one on www?
Yes, www. But the latest novel which I just finished is, as you said, you know, we the computers, but in terms, you know, it was Tamberlane the Great who said we Tamberlane the Great. So in that sense, we computers. It's about the, you know, a poet who decided to create the generative poetry, the poetry which is created by the computers. So he decided to move all the poetry into the computer. And the issue here is, you know, about does the life of the poet matter or not? Or, for example, we've got the poems of Emily Dickinson, let's say, we enjoy them, but we don't know what where the sort of circumstances when she said, when she wrote the particular novel, If we knew, maybe we would have had different perspective on this novel, because what we are interpreting is without the context of life context, without the references, referential points. So do these referential points mean anything or not? So basically, the novel is about Hafiz, the greatest ever lived poet, the Persian poet, the sort of greatest poet ever lived in this world, you know. He is sort of, you know, is filling the form perfectly well, because we know lots of poems of him, 495 poems of him are kept intact, but we know very little about his life. So did his life mean anything or not, you know?
Yeah.
That is the question. That is the question.
The long kind of question about authorship, whether
Yeah.
the author
Is author dead or
yeah,
not?
is the author dead? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So in a French manner, yeah. So once again, it's an Uzbek novel about the connections between the sort of, you know, Oriental poetry and Western technology.
Any final questions from the audience or the computer? Yes, we should plug that this is part of a US tour.
technology allows you to be a cat of Schrödinger as well, because at the same time, I think I'm in the panel in Cambridge University on translation, which was pre-recorded. So that is the technology.
Well, please join me in thanking Hamid Ismailov for joining us.
Thank you. It was one of the most enriching sort of, you know, experiences of reading for me with your questions. Really, really, you know, you made me think really, really deep. Thank you.
Thank you.